Hello, everyone. Aren't we so very prompt today? 7 o'clock on the dot. I wanted to welcome people to our last Taste of Science event. We're going to give it a couple of minutes just because we're hoping that a few more people will join us. But I wish this could have been on a slightly more lighthearted topic. Why? Because tonight's theme is the dreaded COVID-19 variant Omicron. But should we be dreading it? What makes it special? How do we respond to all of this uncertainty? Well, I certainly don't know. This is kind of my jam, but not. Thankfully, we have two very special guests with us today who are going to help us navigate the subject. Before we get to that, though, a little practical information for those of you joining us today. We know some people like to have the closed captions going as we speak. And so if this is the case, you can either head to our Facebook page or on YouTube, you can set your Chrome browser to do the same thing. And you can follow the links that we're pasting in the chat for you to be able to do exactly that. We also have, as I said, the chat, and we'll be posting useful stuff throughout the event, hopefully. Please feel free to join us there and leave your comments and questions for the Q&A later. We'll have some dedicated volunteers curating them all for us so that I can ask them of our guest speakers. We'll also be monitoring the chat, so please be nice. Finally, we'll be expecting a little bit of audience participation in the form of some polls and a little prize-winning trivia. So stay tuned to learn how to play. If you have a second device or screen to use, we recommend you have that handy for our little bit of gameplay. But that's enough for me now. Let me introduce tonight's expert guests, and after hearing their bios, you'll understand why they were invited. So, there we go. First up is Dr. Michael Teng. He received his PhD in immunology from the University of Chicago. Then went on to do a postdoctoral fellowship on viral pathogenesis at the Scripps Research Institute. He was a research fellow at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, where he studied vaccine development. He was an assistant professor at Penn State before moving to the University of South Florida, where he's currently an associate professor at the Morsani College of Medicine in the Department of Internal Medicine. And there, I know he's been studying respiratory viruses since long before it became cool, or very, very uncool, depending on how you look at it. How are you today, Mike?
Great. Good to see you, Parma.
Yes, good to see you too. And our next guest is Dr. Mati Schlachwayo Davis, and she is the Director of Health for the City of St. Louis. She received her medical degree from Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine, and she got a master's in public health degree from Case Western Reserve. She completed her internal medicine residency at University Hospitals Case Medical Center. She's also done a fellowship in infectious diseases. She has done another fellowship in sexually transmitted infections. She's now an international and national medical contributor on COVID-19, and her career passions include community engagement, the care of people living with HIV, and the impact of COVID-19 in marginalized populations. How are you, Mati? Oh, your sound's breaking up.
Thank you so much for having me. That dreaded mute button. I'm so excited to be here.
We're glad to have you. So, as I said before, we would like to have a little bit of feedback from our audience. So I am going to share a little Slido doodad with you. Please just head to slido.com and you can add in the code 934997. And we want to get a little feel for who you are, where you're from. Don't worry, all of this is completely anonymous. but this will give everybody a little bit of idea who else is joining us and potentially why you're feeling what you're feeling. So as I said, our volunteers will be sharing this in the chat as well. So go ahead and click on that link. Oh, David's already mentioned in the chat that he is coming to us from Tampa. I know that because he's in the other room. Okay, so it looks like we've already got a decent spread from all over the place. Oh, are people being shy? I think they're being shy. Okay. So we have a little bit of a spread, but we'll wait for those responses to keep coming in. Next up, I'm wondering what people's background knowledge is. So are you also maybe an expert in the field? Do you get all your knowledge from Twitter or WhatsApp? Let's hope not. Okay, so it looks like very few experts and mostly folks who have been probably panic reading on things like I have. Nice. And then the final one we had for you was, what's the first thing that pops in your head when you hear Omicron? This will be an interesting one, given how much news we've had just in the past couple of days of the rise in the number of cases. Come on, Slido. Me of Pac-Man. I remember there being an awful lot of references to Transformers at the outset. So while we get the last couple of responses from folks, I was asking Mike and Matti at the beginning of just before when we met up. Of course, they're the people, much like me and my family, who end up being the go-tos for answering people's questions about COVID and the virus. So how much of what people are putting up on the board is kind of familiar to you in terms of the kind of stuff that people are asking you? The metal band, goodness. Mike, how much of this sounds familiar in terms of questions you're getting?
Oh, contagiousness, vaccines. I get a lot of vaccines because that's been my major focus of research for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Milder disease. I think everybody wants it to be milder.
Yeah. Matti, how about you?
Interestingly, I kind of gravitated towards the same, but also terrible name, because in the beginning it was so interesting how many people started putting up videos about the correct pronunciation, which I think was just a coping strategy. I don't know if you guys saw those. But for me, also the mutations part, I get a lot of interest in the 50 mutations in the spike protein and that type of talk. But it's interesting to me that contagious is so large, and it means that I actually have something I can contribute today. So I like that.
Excellent. Well, that was good to hear. I think we've kind of accomplished our mission with that. So, without further ado, let's get on to feeding our audience some knowledge. So, as I said, remember to leave your questions in the chat, and our team will be sticking them in a document for me so that I can read them out later. But our first talk is going to be from Mike, who's going to be speaking with us about what's different about the SARS-CoV-2 Omicron variant. So, Mike, over to you.
Thank you. Great. Well, thanks for having me. This part is going to be a little sciencey. I'll try not to be too sciencey about it, but the idea is just to give some basic background as to why this is different and what has changed recently with this SARS coronavirus 2 that we've been living with for almost 2 years now. One of the questions I do get is, where did this thing come from? And why is it always seem to be South Africa? So it was first detected in South Africa, but it was probably also in other countries in the southern part of Africa. We don't really know where it came from, but it's what we call it's kind of like another first generation variant. So if you take a look at this kind of family tree we have on the right-hand side, this is the tree of basically all the different variants that have come out. So green, that large population of green, that's Delta. And then there's Alpha in the yellow. Omicron is actually very distantly related to Alpha. So we think that it's been hiding around somewhere out there for a long time and it hasn't come out recently. But where that long period of time that has been hanging out, we really don't know. There's some ideas that it might be from people who are immunocompromised. Sometimes they get persistent infections. They are infected, and for a long time, the virus sits there and replicates in them. There's also a hypothesis that it's coming from an animal reservoir. So maybe a human infected one of the animals in southern Africa, and it circulated in that animal population. But regardless of where it came from, it really is quite different from the other variants. And the important part here really to think about is that we're not seeing what we would call virus evolution yet. So evolution really means kind of a stepwise change. This is really just the virus kind of adapting to us, trying to figure out how best to infect humans and transmit in the human population. So why did this thing come out? What's different about Omicron? So Mati mentioned that there's a whole bunch of mutations in there. There's a lot of different mutations in the genome, particularly a lot of mutations in the spike protein. The spike protein is the protein that we get vaccinated to, but it's also the one protein on the outside of the virus that is available to see for your immune system. There's a lot of different mutations in there. So if you look at the very right-hand side of the slide, this is kind of a cartoon of what that spike protein looks like. And so the top is the kind of original version of SARS coronavirus 2, no mutations. The second one is Delta, and you can see now there's a few mutations in it. The left-hand cartoon is really the top. It's looking down at the top of the protein. And that's what's really accessible by your immune system. And it's also really how the virus binds to the cell. So now you see that it's kind of adapting that surface to, well, we don't know. In Delta, adapting that surface makes it bind better to its receptor, so it can infect better. But if you look at Omicron, you see a huge concentration of those mutations. So now it's really, really adapted to something. It's either now it's adapted by trying to avoid our immune system, but it's also changed its ability to bind to the receptor. Some of these mutations, this grouping of mutations in the middle, they're shared with some of the other variants. And that's kind of the figure on the left-hand side. So you can see that all of these variants have some mutations in common. The ones in red are the spike protein mutations. So there's some ways that the spike protein has to mutate in order to make it better for it to infect us, and better to avoid the immune response. But Omicron, you can see there's a whole bunch of mutations in there that we haven't really seen together in a set. And that's what really kind of rang the alarm bells when people first discovered this virus, because it was so much different than anything we'd actually seen out there. And some of these mutations then have been associated with the ability of the virus to avoid our immune response. So what's the virus doing out there right now? So as I said, it started in South Africa. So most of the good data we have on what the virus is doing is from South Africa. Although we're starting to get better data from the UK and from Denmark, which does a really great job in providing genomic surveillance for the virus. So they basically sequence something like 40 to 50% of the cases that they get. And what you can see on the right-hand side with the top graph is that the Omicron variant has basically taken over in South Africa. They had a few waves. The beta variant was the one that it was their kind of first variant that came out. They got Delta, and then that started going away, and then Omicron came up really, really, really fast. And the thing here really is that you can see that the slope of the line is basically looks like a rocket ship. It's just basically going up ballistically, whereas all the other ones still had sort of an exponential increase in infections. So this is also one of the worrying things, that it's spreading really fast. If you look at the second graph down there, you can actually see the situation as of a day or so ago in the UK. So they actually have kind of twin pandemics. They have Delta going at the same time as Omicron. And this is useful for us virologists to see how these things can compete. And it looks like Omicron is outcompeting Delta. So Delta seems to be going down a little bit, and Omicron seems to be taking over. So it looks like Omicron will become dominant. Well, Omicron is dominant already in London, and it will probably become dominant in the country in the next few weeks. So the big question is, why is it so dominant? Why is it outcompeting Delta? We know Delta is an extremely infectious virus, and it can cause disease. But we think there's really kind of two things about the Omicron virus, that the variant, that makes it more transmissible than the Delta. First is its ability to avoid the immune response. So with all those mutations on the top of the spike protein, some of the antibodies that we make are not effective anymore at blocking infection. So in South Africa, they've seen a bunch of people get reinfected. They had initial infection either with the beta or the Delta, and then after infection, after they got over it, they got infected again with Omicron. And they're 3 times more likely to get reinfected with Omicron than they were with any of the other variants. We're also starting to see, both in South Africa and the UK and in Denmark particularly, what we call breakthrough infections. Basically, people who have gotten vaccinated but now have gotten infected with the Omicron variant. And so some of these breakthrough infections are occurring more frequently in these vaccinated populations. The one thing we don't really know yet, and it's being studied, is whether the virus itself, regardless of vaccination status, has a higher ability to transmit by itself. That was what made Delta a little bit more potent than Alpha, because the virus itself could just grow faster. This is being tested in the lab right now to see whether Omicron also grows faster, and if that contributes to the increased transmission of this virus that we see. The one thing that we don't know is disease severity. We've seen in South Africa that there's a lower risk for hospitalization, which is a great thing because it's not going to be as bad, but with a virus that's more transmissible, you have more cases. So, the numbers game is not in our favor. But we don't know whether the virus itself is more virulent or not. Okay, so that's kind of the global idea of Omicron transmission. The one thing we are kind of really interested in is how is it spreading in the United States? So on the left-hand side here, you can see those are just the total number of cases that we have daily in the United States. This is from the CDC website yesterday. What you can see with the red curve is a 7-day moving average. Even before we have Omicron becoming dominant here, we're already starting to trend upwards in cases. Again, we're seeing this kind of winter wave after the Delta wave that we had just recently. And this is all still Delta mostly, because if you look on the right-hand side, all those bars represent the different proportions of variants that we see. And the orange is Delta, but you can see that little bit of purple in that last bar, and that's Omicron. And so it's estimated that about 3% of the cases right now in the United States are Omicron. But if you remember from the slide before, that increase in Omicron cases is basically almost a vertical line. So this is going to change, and change rapidly. So the CDC has this genomic surveillance program called SPHERES. It basically has public health labs from the state and federal public health labs, as well as universities and other academic institutions that are trying to do genomic surveillance for Omicron. That means you take the sample, you have to sequence the entire virus. It's kind of time-consuming and laborious. And right now we're sequencing in the United States about 5% of our cases. So this isn't really a great way of trying to keep track of how much Omicron transmission we have. So there are other ways of doing it. There is a PCR test that can be used to detect probable cases. And this is called TACPath. It's used in a lot of clinical labs. What I'm trying to show you on the right-hand side is that the regular PCR tests test for parts of the viral genome. So in this particular example, they're testing for the gene in red and the gene in green. But the TACPath test actually tests for a part of the spike protein, this S protein that's kind of in between the red and the green genes. And that particular test actually kind of fortuitously, they chose the test, they chose that region that has a deletion in the genome for the Omicron variant. And so this is that S delta 6970. It's basically the virus is missing 6 bases. And so the test doesn't work anymore. So when they use the test, that particular test is negative, but the other test is positive. And so when they see this, they call it S gene target failure, or this SGTF. So this is a surrogate marker then for Omicron. And we use this same test for detecting alpha when it came earlier in the spring. And so this is actually going to be, if we can get the public health labs to do more of this particular test, we can actually have a better handle on how Omicron is transmitting. Just to give you an example, the graph underneath the text is data from the Yale School of Public Health doing surveillance in kind of southwestern Connecticut, so the New Haven area. And what you can see using this test and looking for the S gene target failure, they can see now that they've already gotten up to 10% of the cases that they see have this S gene target failure. So it's probable that they're having a really strong increase in Omicron transmission there. So this will be really important for us to be able to track Omicron as things go on. The last couple slides, we'll talk a little bit about vaccination. The idea here is that for vaccination, I guess if you look at the right-hand slide, the primary series of vaccination really isn't all that great at blocking Omicron. It's really good at blocking on the left-hand side is the wild type, the ancestral strain, and then other variants, Delta and now Omicron, is just really not blocked very well by the different vaccines. So mRNA 1273 is Moderna, BNT 162b is Pfizer, and the bottom one is the J&J vaccine. But what you can see on the right-hand side, the very right-hand side, if you boost, now you get a much better response, and you get less drop off of the ability to block this infection. So boosting is going to be extremely important in the next few weeks to try to slow transmission of the virus. And the last thing I want to include is because many people have been relying on the fact that we have these monoclonal antibody treatments to treat once you get infected. So these have been extremely effective at preventing people with risk factors from severe COVID, going to the hospital, dying. Well, the Omicron variant, all those mutations that I showed you in the top of the spike protein, those are pretty effective at blocking or preventing the monoclonal antibodies that we have out there from recognizing the spike protein and blocking infection. So this is a lab study looking at the various available monoclonal antibody cocktails and monoclonal antibodies. And what you can see, the Eli Lilly product, which is a combination of the two antibodies, BAM and ETS, on the right-hand side, doesn't block at all. The Regeneron, RegenCove antibodies don't block at all. The newly authorized AstraZeneca antibodies, they lose efficacy, so they're about 100-fold less effective in this assay. And then of the antibodies that are out there, only really the GlaxoSmithKline antibody, sotrovimab, is still as effective against Omicron as it is against other variants. So we're starting to lose some of our armamentarium to prevent severe infection as well. So that's why vaccination is going to be really essential. And with that, I think I've gone to my time. I will hand it back over to Parthir.
Thank you so much, Mike. So we'll be taking questions throughout, and we'll have a longer Q&A session at the end. But I had a quick technical question for you, which is, so for example, you're saying that these monoclonal antibodies don't work, and obviously we are likely to have to adapt vaccines and whatever else. How quickly are the labs able to adjust things like the diagnostic tests? How easily can they create new antibodies and so on, and vaccines?
So the lab tests are, since they're commercial, it should be relatively easy to switch over to a PCR test that actually detects this S gene target failure. Monoclonal antibodies will be a little bit more difficult because they first have to identify monoclonal antibodies that are not inhibited by these mutations. Both Regeneron and Lilly have a big library of these antibodies, so they can go, I'm sure they're testing them right now, but it's going to take a little bit of time. The vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, are easy to change because it's just sequence. So they change the sequence, but it still takes probably 3 months for them to test those vaccines and then get authorization from the FDA and CDC.
Cool. Yeah. Hopefully those things get along faster than the variants can keep coming out.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. And now we're going to invite up Matti.
Hello.
Hello, hello. Now, I can't imagine trying to control just a few people with regards to their behavior, so I'd be very interested to hear how on earth you deal with an entire city.
Absolutely. It has been a challenge, I'll tell you that. And so, I've just taken on this role as the Director of Public Health just recently, and had to really get into this fairly quickly. And so I want to give some background into my history. And my background really was around looking at the impact of COVID in marginalized populations. So the slide you're looking at here is really what spurred me onto this work, into community engaged work. Prior to this, as an infectious diseases physician and public health expert, I really focused on the care of people living with HIV, again, focused on marginalized populations. But it was when I found myself 7 months pregnant as an infectious diseases doc at the beginning of a pandemic, and was hit with these statistics pretty soon after, where across the board, when you look at the rate ratios of minority populations, as you can see in the latter 4 comments, and you compared the rate ratios compared to white non-Hispanic persons across the board for cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, they were markedly higher. And this was even more stunning when you think about the relatively small proportions that minorities make up in this country currently. And what was even more upsetting is that this is not a new phenomenon. While everybody was shocked and appalled and stunned, right? Those of us who do disparities research and work in these communities know that COVID-19 joins a long list of conditions where this is true, whether it's diabetes or high blood pressures or stroke or other conditions. So like I said, I found myself very quickly being put in the position where I took on the role of the director of health, coming out of my clinical practice, coming out of patient care, really out of a sense of advocacy, right? Starting off as community engaged work, joining the board of health for my city, becoming a medical contributor on news agencies, because the idea of trusted messengers is so important to me. And not many people, I wasn't seeing enough people from infectious diseases backgrounds having these platforms, but certainly not people who represented the very communities that were most affected. So this is an epidemic curve that shows how this has been progressing through my city of St. Louis. And you can tell that there were peaks, particularly around November, December, and January, which interestingly enough is when Dr. Teng was kind of walking us through the first variants coming into this country. This was before people had really started taking the vaccine. And so it was the worst of the times, right? And since then, the case counts in St. Louis are the highest they've been since January 21st of this year, which is very concerning because overwhelmingly all of the cases in my state are attributable still to Delta. And so when you think about the transmissibility curves that Dr. Teng was showing you, we're really in for a difficult time ahead if we have 2 really transmissible variants on the loose. The case positivity rate, which you know is what has been defined by the WHO as one of the metrics that we can use to know whether or not a region or jurisdiction is faring well with COVID and whether or not we can start to maybe, function as we did before. And the magic number there is 5, a case positivity rate of 5. And the current case positivity rate in my city of St. Louis has more than doubled in the last month. Which is, again, very, very concerning. The week-to-week variation varies, so you can't really take that into account. I try to look at that more long-term data to really give me a sense of what's happening. So one of the things I wanted us in our city of St. Louis to focus in on, and that has been happening even before I took on this leadership, was looking at COVID-19 cases by zip code data. And this is really important because I think it allows you to get a geographic sense of where the most at-risk populations are. For us here in the city of St. Louis, those are all clustered in predominantly Black and Brown communities. And unfortunately, the case demographics show a similar story where throughout the pandemic, predominantly African Americans represented in purple have shouldered the burden of disease with 76%. So vaccines have been the most important tool in our toolbox. And one of the first things I had to tend to was rolling out pediatric vaccines. And in ages 5 and above, those who have initiated vaccination in the city of St. Louis are 64.4% and completed is 56.4%. That's a phenomenal number, especially in a state that has had so much trouble getting state level support for some of these endeavors. However, again, there's been vast differences in African American and Asians being able to really take part in those, which has been a problem. And so, like I said, this was the impetus for me. When I talked about the fact that I had a baby at the beginning of the pandemic, I also very quickly after that was bombarded with statistics in Black Maternal Fetal Health Week that said I was 3 times more likely to die at childbirth just by virtue of being Black. And again, those same trends that I showed you in African American communities. So that really was the impetus for me getting involved in community engagement, coming to the stage and really advocating for the most marginalized populations and address some of the disparities. But then came Omicron. So just over a month into my just trying to be a rookie as a director of health for an entire city, transitioning, learning the ropes. You know, I'm a physician and I'm a public health expert, but no political background, no political aspirations, and certainly a steep learning curve when it came to legislation. And then you get the call. All right. And it always has to happen on a Friday because, of course, you can't be given working days to get confirmation and things that you need. And one of the first things that happens is the state calls you, and the state will notify you that we got a lab positive from the genomic sequencing techniques that Dr. Tang was walking us through, and you have a positive case in your city. So what do I have to do in response? Well, my communicable disease team then need to activate and do an investigation, right? Reach out and make sure that we understand what about that person. What are some of the demographics and the information around this person that would allow us to not only keep them safe, but to keep anyone they've come into contact with safe? Because one of the first things you want to do is identify exposures as a result and anticipate how far this has spread. So my contact tracing team immediately spurred into action. And this was a young woman who had recently traveled to a convention. So this was done out of town. So the positive case was actually identified outside. This was someone completely asymptomatic who would not have even gotten tested if another state jurisdiction had not done their contact tracing and notified people all of at the super spreader event that there had been exposure. And rightfully enough, once she got tested, the Omicron variant came back positive. So we completed our investigation. That person had already been quarantined because they came back COVID positive first. And then we had to figure out if, and then the genomic sequencing for Omicron came back afterwards. But where the politics becomes difficult is that I am, overseeing the city level. The state has already gotten this information and they're already getting their press release. So I am telling them, we should not release this. We should not. This is right at the beginning, December 3rd, where we're only weeks away from hearing about this and everybody's in a tizzy and making assumptions without knowing, the 2 out of the 3 of the categories that Dr. Tang walked us through. Yeah, we knew this was spreading fast, but we didn't know anything about severe disease and we didn't know anything about immune evasion. So for me, as a director of health, never make an announcement without confirmation. Why? Because you can have a false positive test. You can have a test, especially early on when we're still learning a variant, that you do not have a high level of certainty that the test that you have that says positive is indeed positive. So I wanted for us to wait until we got CDC confirmation, but that takes time because the sample that's in a lab in Missouri needs to be shipped to the CDC for them to do high-level testing and get confirmation. Because once you've had a test positive in 2 different labs, both of high quality, you can have a high level of certainty. But having learned the ropes, you never know when it's going to go up. So I had to have my communications team draft 2 different responses. One that says we have a suspected case according to these metrics, but we are awaiting CDC confirmation. And the second that says we've received CDC confirmation. And unfortunately, like I suspected, the state went ahead and announced it. So I had to quickly get ahead of that. And because I was prepared within minutes, we were able to do the same, but use intentional language around the time that this wasn't confirmed. For me, the priorities were to make sure that person was safe, to make sure that this was contained and we didn't have other exposures, and then to move towards education. So what I released on social media platforms, I'm almost 40 years old, I'm basically a mom and not the cool lady, but I have had to engage in spaces where I can meet people where they are. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, have my communications team make sure we have a website that's easily accessible, and then have the capacity to make press releases so the press can also utilize their platform responsibly to get people to know. But I wanted to also do simple language that can get to people. We still have a lot to learn about Omicron. No need to panic. We have the tools to stay safe. Get your vaccine or booster if eligible. Wear a mask correctly, especially indoors. Stay 6 feet apart in crowded spaces. Wash your hands often and advocate for global vaccine equity. And I'll talk a little bit about that earlier. It's the reason why I kind of did the preamble as to who I am is because one of the things that was so unfortunate about the way the news broke about Omicron was the misinformation and the irresponsible reporting by certain media outlets calling this the South African variant, where in fact the South African government did the only responsible thing in letting people know. And it was actually sequenced in a whole other country. And even that country, you cannot with a degree of certainty say that that's where it originated. There's no way to tell. The president of Botswana, where it was sequenced, actually said when they did their contact tracing, 4 diplomats from Europe had recently traveled to Botswana, and that is where they had traced this case. So again, this irresponsible reporting that resulted in travel bans against 8 African countries, 6 of which didn't even have Omicron yet, but out of an abundance of caution, became such an unfortunate way to already seemingly punish these low-income countries that are already struggling and who did the ethical thing in letting us know using their superior genomic sequencing technologies. So for me, quelling the panic, fighting misinformation, and making that education clear was the case. So we put out a press release, and then I put out this right side by side so that you could have the more detailed version, wade through that. But you want to make sure that people with lower health literacy who need something that they can copy and paste and put in their WhatsApp groups or their text groups or on their social media can have. And this slide actually went viral the week that I put it out because it was an easy way for people to visualize this. So a lot of times people ask me, well, what can I do? Well, you're going to have friends, family, community members. Maybe you work in areas where you can talk to people. And one of the things I like to do is just dedicate 5 or 10 minutes to say, do you want to talk about COVID? What questions do you ask? Ask what is really bothering people. Acknowledge and apologize if they've had negative experience for valid mistrust with healthcare institution or scientific communities, and then educate in simple, accessible ways. And for those of you who have been vaccinated or who have experience, I use that. I don't lecture people like doctors so love to do and speak down to them. I talk about the fact that I'm afraid of needles, and then when I had my shot, it was fine for the first 6 hours, but after that, my arm started to feel sore, but it went away after 12 hours. And I weave in then the CDC criteria and symptoms or expectations so that it can meet people where they are. I think what is important to understand with Omicron is a few things. Number one, that we know very little. There's so much we don't know. Dr. Tang talked about the fact that, there's preliminary data that says that this is mild, but a lot of that data is coming out of African countries with lower life expectancies and a much younger population. So we need to see something more generalizable with a lot more data to see how does this fare in high income countries like ours with older populations? Will that mild disease data still persist? We also don't know a lot. We are thankful that Pfizer's already been able to reassure us about boosters, but we need to work with what we have, which is we have tools available to protect ourselves against COVID, educate people, quell the panic, and allow scientists time to do what they do and really allow us to understand how this is going to be in real time, because we know it's coming. And what I loved about Dr. Tang's presentation is that as a public health director, I need to prepare my city either way. We know this thing spreads fast, so that if people are mildly sick, I have to then prepare myself for overwhelmed hospital systems. We're in winter. People are going to get flu, a slew of other respiratory viruses, and COVID. And with higher transmissibility, we can't be in a situation where we run out of ER beds, which is already happening, run out of ventilators, because then death will come, not necessarily because it's driven by the severe disease by COVID, but because we are overwhelmed by all of the disease that's within our cities and jurisdictions. And so one of the things that I think is important when you think about leading at public health atmospheres is identifying your trusted messengers. Who are the people who have earned the trust of the communities? When I was doing a pediatric rollout, that's schools. That's FQHCs, federally qualified health centers, and community partners that have earned the trust of minority communities. That's their doctors, if they are fortunate enough to have one, or healthcare systems that take care of them. So remove ego and the need for me to say, I, the health department, am responsible for all the vaccines, and have kids come to dreary healthcare buildings. Send them to where they're most comfortable. Educate people about what trusted resources are. Although I use these social media platforms, I use them to inform people about the fact that the CDC, the FDA, and others who are trusted resources, where can they go for those? And Google or the latest chat in a chat group is not it. And finally, you know, it is my responsibility as a director of health to advocate for data, because data is justice. Data drives policy and funding to address misinformation and disinformation, to put novel programs in place to prepare our communities and make sure that everything is equitable. So I will stop now and take any questions. If you need to reach out to me, I've put some information there and how you can follow me for a lot of the education I do. But it's been a pleasure to have this talk, and I'm looking forward to what's always my favorite part, is the ability to hear from y'all and answer questions.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I completely agree with you. Like I was baffled by all of the bans when countries already had cases in their countries. I'm like, well, what's closing the borders going to do now? That the horse is bolted, right? Or enclosed, depending on how you want to use that metaphor.
You know, I was fortunate enough to listen to a Grand Rounds live from Anthony Fauci earlier on in the pandemic. And one of the things he reflected on is what's made COVID so different, amongst other things, and even from other epidemics that we have survived, like the HIV in the 80s, is how highly politicized this is, how irresponsibly both parties weaponized this for political gain, and how that reduced mistrust. And I believe that, you know, this is an unfortunate extension of that. The same people that criticized travel bans a year ago are somehow trying to legitimize them. We know after 2 years that they're not impactful. We know that they only serve to make it so much more difficult from countries that are already struggling. And what's 8 countries going to do when we already had evidence of community transmission within days? And even if it was out of an abundance of caution, why not pull back now? What is the data to support that this is in any way helpful and not just performative and punitive? So I've been wildly disappointed and definitely vocal about this using my platforms, because it only spreads xenophobia and stigma for countries that already suffer from those very things. So it is something that I believe is unacceptable, and they must stop now. The UK, shamefully, who had done the same thing, at least were able to pull back days ago. Where is the US? Where is our leadership?
Yeah. And in the case of the UK, they honestly don't have a leg to stand on.
I mean,
so yeah, I'm going to pull Mike up here as well, and we're going to give you a brief respite while I share a very silly little bit of trivia. So for folks who are watching today, if they want to try and win some Taste of Science swag, or if you want to take this as a 5-minute break to go and grab some water or close your eyes or whatever it is you need to do, you can feel free to do so. No, I think these are going to be very softball things for our guests. I certainly hope I didn't get anything wrong while I was curating this, so that would be embarrassing. But yes, so you can go to quizzes.com or joinmyquiz.com rather, and enter this code. And yes, play along with us today. Let's get some swag. Yes, indeed. Or not. Oh. Yep. I'll give that another minute or so. We have a message from Michael who said, I missed out on my Taste of Science coffee cup at the event in New York. And so it's time for him to redeem himself. What was the code again? The code is on the screen. So 724476. All right. I think we might get some more people to join, but let's start this now. So first up, when was COVID-19 first declared a pandemic? Was it December 23rd, Was it January 30th, March 11th in 2020, or was it April 2nd of 2020? March 11th. Yes. And soon after, most of us went into some form of lockdown. Now, I'm going to turn the music off for that. Next question. All right. According to the CDC, how many SARS-CoV-2 variants are currently considered to be of concern? So given this is a CDC, this is going to be in the US. Is it 2? Is it 4? Is it 5? Or is it 8? Dun, dun, dun. Time's up. It's currently 2. If you look at the World Health Organization, the numbers might be different because they vary country by country. So, what type of receptor does the spike protein bind to gain entry to the cell? Mike is looking very smug at this point. Is it MACHR? Is it GABA? Is it CB2? Or is it ACE2? And it is the ACE2 receptor. I'm impressed that pretty much everybody knew that. Next question. With regard to the name, everybody complaining about the terrible name. At what position does the letter Omicron fall in the Greek alphabet? Is it 9th? Is it 11th? Is it 12th? Or is it 15th? Now, obviously, for those who've been paying attention to kind of the variants of interest, this is a kind of indicator for how many of them there have been. 15th. So yes, that we've been going through the variants, but I guess the ones of concern are far fewer than that. Okay, what does COVID-19 actually stand for? This is an open-ended one. Hopefully we added in all the variations that people might use. Oh, people struggling with this one? Oh, yes, it was a tough one. So coronavirus disease 2019. Okay. I don't think we have too many left. Okay, so dyspnea is one of the symptoms of COVID-19, but what does it mean? So is it high blood pressure? Is it shortness of breath? Is it low oxygen levels? Or is it respiratory failure? This is a cheeky one because this is the kind of stuff we work on in the lab that I'm in. All right, just for a change, we're not dealing with a Greek word, but this time we're dealing with a Latin one. So it actually translates as being bad breathing. So yes, shortness of breath. And then this is our last question. The R0 gives us the expected number of cases directly generated by one case in a population where all individuals are susceptible to infection. What does the R stand for? Again, hopefully we've given you a few options and we've been lenient on one of them. Oof. Ouch. That one hurts. Yes, so it's the reproduction rate or the reproductive rate. And that's it. So let's see who ended up being our winner. We have Michael Martin. Yes, you redeemed yourself after all that. Well done. So I'm going to say, send us an email at contact@tasteofscience.org so that we can ship out your goodies to you. But yes, now that that's over with, we're going to go back to our guests and hopefully answer some of the questions that people have been feeding through to us. So actually, Michael was the first one to come up with a question for us, I believe. And he said, based on the increased transmission of Omicron, would the criteria for close contact change from the current CDC definition of 15 minutes within 6 feet? And I guess, is that one for you, Matty?
That came through during Michael's, but I'm happy to look at it. Based on the increased transmission of Omicron, that's not necessarily how we make the criteria. The criteria is based on the overall way that the virus is transmitted, and that doesn't change from variant to variant. So no, we would not expect that to change.
Okay. So this one from David, is the booster just better, or is it just that people with a booster have received the jab more recently? Is that why they're doing better with Omicron?
That has to do a little bit with your immune response. So if you have a booster, so your primary series of vaccine teaches your immune response, and your immune response comes up and then goes down. But while it's down, it's not just sitting there doing nothing. It's actually relearning. So it's actually changing the antibodies that it produces so that they're more effective antibodies. It's called affinity maturation. So they make higher, better antibodies to neutralize the virus. So when you come back with a booster, you stimulate it again. Now you give it another shot at making even higher affinity antibodies. So it's actually, it's not just doing the same thing over and over. It's synergistic rather than an additive effect of the booster.
No. So as a follow-up to that, do you know much about whether it helps to have the different kinds of vaccine? Because there's some places that were saying that it's if you had, for example, Johnson & Johnson, it's better to have one of the mRNA ones or vice versa.
Yeah, it seems that the mRNA boosters are better, just kind of empirically. I'm not really sure why, but the Moderna booster seems to give a little bit better response. My bias is just that it's got more mRNA in it because it's a 50 microgram dose versus a 30 microgram dose from the Pfizer, so you're getting a little bit extra. But I don't think anybody's really knows for sure. But if you actually look at some of the data, the gradation is the Moderna, then Pfizer, and then a booster of the Johnson & Johnson is well below that.
Okay. So one from Eric, which is, does the common flu also undergo these similar mutations, and should we be monitoring these as extensive as we're doing for COVID-19?
So the flu doesn't actually have these huge mutations that we see. So when I showed you that kind of family tree of the viruses, they're popping up kind of all different. They're all kind of siblings. What we see with the flu is that we're seeing descendants of the ones that are already out there. So they change in a smaller way to require us to have flu shots every year. And the fact of the matter is we do monitor flu, maybe not quite as extensively as we're doing with SARS coronavirus 2, but we have something like 125 influenza surveillance laboratories across the world that monitor influenza viruses that are potentially epidemic versions of flu. And so every year, that's how we get our flu vaccine. People have gone out and sampled flu, sequenced it, and looked for the ones that are most likely to be the ones that come out for epidemics.
Yeah. So, Mati, how do you deal with this from the public health perspective? Like, presumably there are a lot of things that you need to track. COVID is the one that we're talking about right now, but there must be much more.
Yeah, I think it's important. Unfortunately, I didn't take the job at a time where I have the luxury of just focusing on COVID. Non-COVID related priorities didn't go away. So I always tell people I have priorities in parallel. And especially in the winter, it's so important to make people understand that you've got to get your flu shot, you've got to get your COVID vaccine. And now we know, a lot of people in their heads believe you can't get them both together and space them out. And there's no reason to do that. Get protected as early as possible. Do it now. And you can get both of them at the same time. So it's a lot of education. But again, it's needing public health dollars. I'm in the state that's the lowest public health funded state in the country. And that makes it difficult. There's a question that's coming later around burnout, and that's very real. I'm understaffed. I have full burnout. Folks are doing the jobs of 3 to 5 people. Canvassers and contact tracers quit because they don't make any money, and they were getting a lot of abuse, people using them as low-hanging fruit to take their frustrations out. So it's a really difficult time for public health. So being innovative, using partnerships, but focusing on education in different ways, doing things like this, getting on webinars, doing town halls, utilizing all the different ways that people like to engage to make sure that we're getting the word out.
Yeah. So I love the idea of the innovation, because I was talking to one of my colleagues who has an 8-year-old daughter, and she hates vaccines. And so her mum managed to find this podcast to play to her, where I can't remember who the organization was, but they'd recorded other children having the vaccine. And they did a kind of blow-by-blow account of what their experience was. And the kids would come back like, oh, that needle's so small. And oh, that hardly hurt at all. Like, I didn't notice a thing. And really, as a result of that, just that, her daughter was reassured, and she was like, sign me up.
Yeah. I love that. We're using auditoriums at schools where we can show movies, because the anticipation makes kids even more anxious and they tend to act out. And so, we have Band-Aids that are kid appropriate. We have people who are actually like kids for the 15-minute afterwards who will talk to them and distract them. It's just trying to be thoughtful, especially on a limited budget, about there's things you can do for free to make things better for people, or for at little cost. So we're really trying to tap into that.
Yeah. So going back to the vaccine itself, Gary asks, if we know the genomic sequence of Omicron, can we have an mRNA vaccine specifically targeting, and why aren't we addressing this as a booster option?
So the answer to the first question is yes, we can absolutely have an Omicron-specific mRNA vaccine, and I believe I heard the CEO of Moderna say that they're already working on it. The one problem, again, is, well, first off, the booster that we do have works, and it works pretty well at inducing better immunity to protect against infection with Omicron. The second part of it really is, again, coming back to that first slide, we're seeing all these kind of first-generation variants coming out. So we're not seeing evolution, we're only seeing adaptation. So we don't, making a variant-specific booster is really only going to be kind of useful if that's the kind of baseline, right? If everything's going to evolve from that one, then it makes a lot more sense to make that as the base vaccine. So we thought it was going to be Delta. I thought it was going to be Delta. I thought, make a Delta-specific vaccine. Everything's going to evolve from Delta. And then Omicron's come along. And so, yeah, it's the good thing is that the vaccine works really well right now. But in the end, I think we will eventually have to have something different as the baseline vaccine.
Yeah. And I think probably a lot of us imagined everything kind of, as you say, branching off from the first kind of genomic sequence. And obviously things are able to develop in parallel rather than, as a result of the initial one. So that's something I hadn't even considered. So yes, Matti touched on this earlier. but Michael was saying, congratulations on your baby. We hope the little one's doing well. His family's in St. Louis. But what about the medical professional burnout? How will the medical community hold up with this next wave?
Oh, that's such a great question, Michael, and thanks for asking. I do believe that behavioral health has gotten, mental health and has gotten a lot worse. Medical professional burnout being a big component of that, and hospitals need to commit to supporting their staff, hearing them, making sure they have access to timely therapy and other resources as they need it, being thoughtful about how shifts have done, being compassionate about people's needs, and also understanding some of the disparities around women and people with families who don't have the opportunity, who need, that type of support. People who are single and have lived alone in isolation during lockdown, for example, and I didn't see enough support around that. There's always this focus on people like me who have kids. And so I do believe that that was real. We've lost a lot of people because of the burnout, because of also their personal beliefs and not wanting to get the vaccine. And we will feel the damage of that for a long, long period. And so really rebuilding that workforce from the youngest age up, but also still engaging those folks and not giving up on them, not believing that that's a hard stop, I think is super important. I truly apologize. I'm a working mom and I have a hard stop because our childcare is leaving. And so I have 2 kids unattended. But I did want to just quickly address, I think there was one other question that may be towards me. And they were talking about the nursing doctor labor market looking like, and I think I addressed that. Really tough right now, especially for people who feel like they've been cornered, even though that's not the intent. I think nobody is really running to go into this market, especially the folks on the front lines usually make less money. And so who's running to a high stress, really overwhelming environment for which they're not getting compensated? Not a lot of folks. And so it's been very discouraging. I'm not going to lie to you, especially our nurses who I believe are the true heroes. It really annoys me when subspecialized people like me, who have so much more privilege, get to be the frontline doctors. And it's like, it's our nursing staff, it's our cleaning staff, it's the people who bring food and who risk their lives every day. Those are the frontline heroes. And that's where we've seen the most issues. And then I did see a question around how this will be polarizing for future vaccines. And I thought that was an incredible question, actually, because you're right. The damage that this continues to do, I think, is compounded and will continue. I like to tell people that one of the things we didn't do a good job of is making people understand that medicine, infectious diseases are not a monolith. They evolve and change, and so do the recommendations. And people saw that as us being not knowing what we're talking about or inconsistent or telling lies. And it's like, no, we should have just a better job of making people understand. And that's the same with the vaccine. Unfortunately, a lack of vaccine confidence, what people called hesitancy at the beginning of this, I think has evolved and has made it difficult for other vaccines that will come into play. And again, we need to take the lessons learned and do a better job moving forward. At least it means I'll be gainfully employed. You got to laugh to not cry, folks. But yeah, that's unfortunately been the case. So I'm sorry for the rapid fire at the end, but I did want to make sure questions.
I completely appreciate that, and we really appreciate the fact that you squeeze time into your busy schedule for both of you.
Always, yeah.
And so before we kind of finally close up, I wanted to share Matti and Mike's social media handles, so you can go and ask them more questions there because they've got nothing better to do with their time. I joke. I know everybody's very, very busy, everybody who's working in the field. And honestly, like, I'm sure most of us are really depressed because we were hoping at this stage that we'll be starting to see some reprieve. As an event organizer, we were hoping to have in-person events soon. And that's kind of, it's back on the maybe list of things to do. Yeah, and one final shout out to the volunteers who've been helping us out in the background tonight with kind of getting the questions. And yeah, thank you. Bye, Matti. And Mike, thank you again so much for for appearing today. And I hope we get to run across each other in the halls again. It's been a while.
Yeah, it has been a while since we've seen each other.
Yeah. So, good luck to you and your family, and happy holidays to everyone who's been watching. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Stay safe.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.